So I want to take a look at a recent video made by Dr. Todd Grande. Dr. Grande is a very well-respected mental health professional here on YouTube who discusses a wide variety of topics, including mental health disorders, criminal cases, and current issues in general in the media. I sort of think of him as a moist critical type of character with a PhD in mental health, if that makes any sense. He recently made a video regarding the investigation of Dr. Jordan Peterson by the CPO, or the College of Psychologists of Ontario, which is the licensing board of psychologists in Ontario, Canada. So if you're not very familiar with Jordan Peterson, he is a controversial Canadian clinical psychologist who currently doesn't really treat patients, but is more of a public figure and right-wing grifter. And after years of online hate speech, mainly towards the transgender community, the board, or the CPO, wanted him to take basically continuing education, social media coaching classes to attempt to curb his psychotic behavior on social media platforms and media in general. He obviously refused this offer, and now the CPO is considering revoking his psychology license. So we're going to skip most of Peterson's background information in this video, and we're just going to jump right into the main issues I have with Dr. Grande's take on this issue.
Now moving to the timeline of the incident. In 2018, Jordan entered into an agreement with the regulatory board for his profession, called the College of Psychologists of Ontario. This is referred to as the CPO, not to be confused with C-3PO, the famous droid from Star Wars, who evidently has more personality than these board members. Jordan had been the subject of a misconduct complaint regarding communication and boundaries. He agreed to work on improving his communication skills to his clients. The situation was not considered a formal disciplinary action by the board, and what exactly led to the situation was never revealed. Like, we don't know what Jordan did or didn't do that caused problems. He may not have done anything wrong.
So this is the first complaint of misconduct brought to the board in regards to communication and boundaries with his personal clients. So there was no disciplinary action taken, but as Dr. Grande points out, we don't know the specifics of the case. All we know is someone filed a complaint. Nothing serious, just worth taking note of, as with any complaint against a healthcare professional.
In 2022, Jordan would once again have interactions with the CPO. This time they were upset with Jordan because of public statements. They had received about 12 complaints from various people over a 4-year period. None of the people were current or former clients of Jordan Peterson. None of them were acquainted with the client. Some of the people complaining did not even live in Canada. Here are a few.
So now we start getting into public complaints to the CPO regarding statements made by Peterson. And Dr. Grande's issue is that there were complaints coming from Canada as well as other places in the world. At this point, he is a public figure, not seeing patients, so every complaint would be coming from people who are listening to him on social media and or people or groups of people he is directly harassing on social media. There is no rule, at least that I'm aware of, that complaints can only come from patients or Canadian citizens.
Few examples of what people were complaining about. The tweet Jordan published about the transgender actor that resulted in him being banned from Twitter.
So let's take a look at this tweet in particular. Peterson says, "Remember when pride was a sin and Ellen Page had her breasts removed by a criminal physician?" In this tweet, Dr. Peterson is stating that homosexuality is wrong and a sin, presumably punished by hell, while also calling out transgender actor Ellen, now Elliot Page, for having a double mastectomy, saying that physicians who perform surgical interventions for transgender people should be imprisoned. Not stopping there, when called out about the tweet, Peterson doubled down, comparing the situation to, quote, fascist physicians who performed Nazi experiments. That's right, he called surgeons performing life-changing operations to a vulnerable population analogous to literal Nazi physicians practicing inhumane surgical experiments on Jews during the Holocaust. And again, behind these opinions is a license to practice psychology, giving these statements more weight. Okay, we'll move on with the video here.
A tweet about an overweight swimsuit model. Tweets criticizing Justin Trudeau and other politicians. A joke that Jordan made about the Prime Minister of New Zealand. A retweet of a comment made about COVID-19 lockdowns. A tweet about a police chief who wanted to remove children from a Freedom Convoy protest site.
You can
and
see
an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast,
right-wing
where Jordan
grifting
made comments about the
in most
transgender
of these
community.
tweets, and this is just a small
Due to these various
size.
complaints, the CPO ordered Jordan to complete a mandatory continuing education program. If he refused, it may constitute professional misconduct and result in an investigation. In theory, an investigation could lead to Jordan's license being suspended, which means he could not see clients or supervise. Jordan has not engaged in either of these activities for several years, but it would still be unsettling for him to lose his license. Jordan posted a letter that he was sent from the CPO. Here is a summary of it. Much of this is paraphrased. Jordan must complete a coaching program within 6 months. This will allow him to review, reflect on, and ameliorate his professionalism in public statements. The coach will have access to the complaints and other information from the CPO. Jordan will have to pay the coach a fee not to exceed $225 an hour. If Jordan does not comply with the terms set out by the CPO, or if the coach is unhappy with his progress, it may result in an allegation of professional misconduct and disciplinary action. Jordan wasn't too happy about this proposal sent by the CPO. He stated that he was not going to submit to re-education, which is a term that they did not use, but I think he's trying to stir up a little bit of trouble by using that particular phrase. He would not admit that his viewpoints were either wrong or unprofessional. Jordan applied for a judicial review with the Ontario Divisional Court. Now moving to my analysis. Before looking specifically at the situation with Jordan Peterson, I want to offer some background about how licensing boards function in general. This is not specific to the CPO. When a person has a license to practice in any particular field, whether it's related to psychotherapy or not, they take on the responsibility of adhering to a code of ethics. The job of any licensing regulatory board is to protect the public by making sure that licensees live up to that commitment.
So pay attention to that quote. When a person has a license to practice in any field, they take on the responsibility of adhering to a code of ethics. The job of any licensing regulatory board is to protect the public by making sure that licensees live up to that commitment.
Boards also issue new licenses. They spend most of their time on that activity, typically somewhere around 90% of their time. Licensing boards are configured differently depending on the jurisdiction, but generally a board comprises professional and public members who are appointed by a government official or elected. Board members can only serve for a certain period of time, and typically they work for free or receive minimal compensation. Typically, the boards themselves are regulated by a larger government entity, usually something with a name like Department of Professional Regulation or Department of Professional Licensing. This department may oversee dozens of different boards for various professions. For example, boards for psychotherapists like counselors, social workers, psychologists, and marriage and family therapists, medical professionals like physicians, nurses, and paramedics, and other professionals like electricians, real estate agents, home inspectors, architects, athletic trainers, and riverboat pilots. Individual licensing boards get their information about various incidents from the department. Typically, it is the department that would conduct any investigation. Only if the investigation reveals some wrongdoing would the complaint ever make it before the board for any type of decision, like imposing disciplinary sanctions. The vast majority of complaints are dismissed without any action, because many are frivolous, unsupported, untrue, or filed with an ulterior motive. A few examples of complaints that would normally be dismissed: a husband and wife are in a divorce, so the husband files a complaint against his wife's therapy license. A client owes money to a psychotherapist, therefore complains in order to avoid paying it. A man files a complaint against his daughter's psychotherapist because he is not happy with the advice that she is getting. If every complaint resulted in some type of discipline, no profession would ever exist. It would be impossible to attract new people into the field. Nobody wants to work in a field where their livelihood can be obliterated on the whim of an unhappy customer. Boards have an incredible
So obviously there's going to be frivolous complaints to the board, especially when it comes to high-profile figures like Jordan Peterson. But the board's job is to determine if these complaints are valid or not. People lose their license every day in healthcare for a variety of reasons. And I think it's better to err on the side of caution and at least investigate these claims rather than disregarding all of them without so much as a thought. Look at policing, for example. I feel like one of the major differences between the justice system and healthcare is accountability. Police officers don't even have a license to be a cop. So when investigated, most of the time by their own department, the officer in question is either laid off only to find a job in a neighboring jurisdiction or put on paid leave until the situation blows over. Although not perfect, in general, healthcare professionals are held to a higher standard, which I think is a good thing.
Boards have an incredible responsibility when regulating a profession. They have to be fair not only to the public, but to the professionals. If they are soft on offenders, they endanger the public. If they are heavy-handed against professionals, they will destroy their profession and eliminate the services that the public needs. Being on a licensing board is not about power, it is about service. Now, looking at the case of Jordan Peterson and the CPO, based on what I could find out about this board from various sources, they appear to have a broad amount of authority over the professionals. This is not unusual. Typically, a board has more authority than it uses, like they can interfere in more areas than they actually do. For example, the professionals regulated by the CPO must follow this guideline about public statements, advice, or comments. Quote, the statements are accurate and supportable based on current professional literature or research, unquote, and, quote, the statements are consistent with the professional standards, policies, and ethics currently adopted by the college, unquote. This means that the CPO can pretty much sanction any professional under their authority anytime they want it, based on innocuous social media posts or really any type of public statement. Under this policy, there is no room for opinion. Everything a professional says is required to be factual. This is a ridiculous and unattainable standard.
And why is this really an issue? Like he just said, the CPO has more authority than it tends to use, which means we typically don't hear much from them except in extreme cases such as this. They aren't out there searching Facebook for psychologists posting about QAnon with 2 likes. But if that person started to get complaints, what is the problem with investigating them? If the CPO finds something that violates their code of conduct or code of ethics, just like any other profession or license you receive, you can be subject to investigation and ultimately have your privileges to use this license revoked. For example, I'm a registered nurse. If I go online spouting crazy anti-vax rhetoric, I'm subject to investigation and my license being revoked due to being a threat to public health. If I go on a podcast with millions of people listening and present myself as a healthcare professional, my words hold more weight than a mechanic, for example. In fact, since 2021, many nurses have been fired or have their license suspended or revoked for doing just that.
Is Jordan Peterson really the only professional they regulate who made statements that were not based on research literature? No other psychotherapist ever made any statements about politics, popular culture, religion, or philosophy? I find that impossible to believe.
No, of course not. But like I said, they aren't going to comb through the entirety of social media looking for people saying crazy things that have 2 followers on Facebook. But sure, if somebody complains about this person with 2 followers talking about white supremacy, yeah, go ahead and investigate. I just don't see the problem with this. Also, just because you have an opinion on a subject doesn't mean it's harmful. That is literally what the board is there for, to determine whether or not these statements are harmful. If a psychologist is doing interviews seen by millions of people claiming the Holocaust was a hoax and white people are supreme to all other races, can we maybe take a closer look at this person? What is your line in which someone would have to cross to have their license revoked or even investigated? I think it's important for any board to make sure their credibility isn't being harmed as well. We know that Peterson's license gives his opinions on these topics more weight than other people. So if these opinions are not factual, as well as discriminatory or hateful in nature, he's actively causing harm in an already vulnerable community of people.
What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Jordan Peterson is a controversial figure who makes a lot of philosophical and political statements. Some of his statements make sense, and some don't, but all of them elicit some type of strong response. Many people love him, and he has his fair share of detractors. Predictably, these 2 groups tend to fall along political lines. At least a few members of the CPO, perhaps the majority, became aggravated by Jordan's political ideology. It upset them that he had the right to speak freely. Perhaps they thought that right only belonged to people who agreed with them. Using a technicality, specifically the fact that Jordan has a professional.
So basically your theory here is that the Board of Psychologists of Ontario got triggered because Peterson was using his credentials to spread literal hate speech against vulnerable populations, so they decided to investigate, offered him remediation, which he obviously refused, and now are considering revoking his license that he no longer uses? If anything, I think he's gotten more leeway than a non-celebrity figure would if they had said most of these things.
License, they targeted him in order to silence him. I think this board inappropriately used their power to punish Jordan Peterson for his political beliefs. It is extremely rare for any type of psychotherapist to be disciplined by a board based on complaints that do not come directly from a client or supervisee. For that matter, it's rare even if the complaints do come from a client or supervisee. Jordan Peterson has attracted complaints from random people who never received services from him, yet the board is treating these complaints as if they have merit. All these complaints should have been dismissed immediately as a matter of routine.
Again, why does it matter where the complaints come from? He doesn't even practice anymore. So the only place these complaints would come from are, quote, random people who haven't received services from him. So is the board supposed to just ignore complaints coming from random people regarding the most well-known psychologist in public view currently? That seems irresponsible.
The irony of this case is that the CPO is proving Jordan Peterson's point. They are validating his ideology. He has often warned about the dangers of tyrannical government systems. that desire to limit free speech. And here he is, the target of a government entity.
This isn't limiting free speech. Once again, he can speak all he wants. His license is a privilege, not a right. If they decide to strip him of his license, they have every right to.
Which is trying to silence him. In addition, he has been critical of academia, which is largely populated by people who earned PhDs. 8 of the CPO board members have PhDs. Many people may disagree with Jordan Peterson, but just because he's a psychotherapist doesn't mean that he has lost his right to speak freely. There is no political belief requirement to be a mental health professional, and if one was ever imposed, the mental health professions would be annihilated in an instant.
Of course, there isn't a political requirement, but there is a code of conduct that you referenced yourself and is referenced all over the CPO website. It just so happens that Republicans tend to violate that code of conduct all the time. Let's take a quick look at the CPO Code of Ethics and Conduct. So this is the first page you get to when you go to the College of Psychologists of Ontario website. And as you can see, it is pretty much the polar opposite of everything Jordan Peterson stands for, if you've ever listened to him speak for more than 2 minutes. If we come down here to the college's role as regulator, it reads, the college's mandate is to protect the public interest through the regulation of the practice of psychology. In doing so, it must always consider and reflect upon its role as regulator with respect to the important issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, a role which is distinct from that of a professional association whose mandate includes advocacy. While advocacy falls outside the college mandate, we do have a key role in providing guidance and resources to our members that empower them to employ sound clinical and ethical judgment in making decisions that will benefit the individuals, families, and communities being served. This includes considerations that members must take into account related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Jordan Peterson is clearly violating all of these terms when he tweets things like this.
If Jordan is forced to attend any training or hearings, it is likely he's going to record them and post the videos on social media. When it comes to debating, Jordan Peterson has a reputation for being well-prepared, assertive, and relatively quick-witted. I think that these CPO board members might find themselves a bit outclassed during any adversarial public interaction with Jordan Peterson. They will probably end up being embarrassed as badly as they wanted to embarrass him. I think it would be particularly interesting to see the content of the education they would like to provide to Jordan, like they are going to give him advice on how to be appropriate on social media. This is like an umpire trying to teach Babe Ruth how to hold a baseball bat.
What? An umpire teaching Babe Ruth how to use a baseball bat? What a backwards analogy. Jordan Peterson has gotten himself banned from Twitter because of hate speech and is just all around incompetent at using social media in general. Just last month, I am assuming, jokingly tweeted that it was getting more difficult to find CP on Twitter with a totally non-creepy smiley face at the end. A better analogy would be like Bill Burr trying to explain comedy to Brendan Schaub. It's never going to stick, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Now moving to my final thoughts. It appears as though at least some of the CPO board members became angry at Jordan Peterson. In the absence of the appropriate skills needed to debate Jordan in a proper form, they misused their positions to attack his right to speak freely. Through this nefarious process, the board members eroded the institution of board service, the public trust, and embarrassed themselves as professionals. They set out to teach Jordan Peterson a lesson about having an opinion, and instead taught the world a lesson about government corruption and misuse of power.
Jordan Peterson is the only one embarrassing himself in this situation, and now possibly you for your free speech absolutist boner you have with this. And where is their corruption? All I'm seeing is a licensing board concerned about the integrity of their establishment, as well as any harm that's being done due to Peterson's license propping up his opinions. I am a fan of Dr. Grande and his work. I just think he is way off on this take. The amount of charitability he gives Peterson while not even attempting to look at it from the board perspective is unbelievable. I almost feel like he came into this trying to be so unbiased towards Peterson that he actually became biased towards the board. Being a public healthcare professional these days, especially when you have the influence, the likes we really have never seen before, we need to start having discussions regarding the danger that one can possess simply by spreading harmful information with a medical license behind your words. I think a good recent example of this would be Dr. Oz. Though he still holds his license, he never gave harmful advice or opinions in regards to his specialty, which is cardiothoracic surgery. If he had, I'm sure the Board of Medicine would have been investigating. His opinions, while insane and possibly criminal, had more to do with nutrition and other topics, but didn't really concern cardiothoracic surgery. When it comes to Peterson, his opinions are that of his specialty. His opinions and behavior are completely incompatible of the field in which he practices. So in conclusion, I just think Dr. Grande is way off the mark on this one, and I think it's just more of that kind of Americanized free speech absolutism that he's kind of taking to heart here, which I really don't think applies as far as Dr. Peterson's license is concerned when he is tweeting and saying the things that he is saying on social media and in life in general when you do have a following the size that he does. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks.